The sharp crack of a palm against skin echoed through the marble corridors of the latte department store like a gunshot. Naomi's head snapped to the side, her deep warm brown skin flaring a brilliant, painful red where the blow landed. She stumbled back into a display of $5,000 silk scarves, her breath hitching as her simple cotton dress snagged on a crystal fixture. For a heartbeat, the bustling luxury district of Seoul went deathly still. Welcome to Syndicate Seoul Stories. Hey everyone, please tell us where you're watching from in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on all notifications. Your support makes all the difference for us to keep creating these emotional stories. Naomi looked up, her jaw slack with shock and her almond eyes wide, staring at the man who loomed over her. Derek Lawson, her ex-husband. The man who had stripped her of her savings, her dignity, and her home in Atlanta 5 years ago before dumping her in a city where he thought she'd drown. I told you to stay out of my sight, Naomi, Derek hissed, adjusting the gold chain over his branded jacket, his face twisted in a sneer of pure disdain. Look at you. Still a charity case. You don't belong in a place like this. Derek had no idea who she was anymore. He had no idea that the broke ex-wife he'd left with nothing, the woman who once lived on convenience store ramen and washed her hair in public sinks, was dead. He had no idea about the custom-fit wedding band hidden beneath the sleeve of her modest cardigan, or the 60th floor penthouse overlooking the Han River she had woken up in that morning. He certainly had no idea about the black titanium card in her plain shoulder bag that could buy the very store they were standing in. But most dangerously, Derek had no idea about the man whose name now protected hers. He didn't see the 4 shadows in charcoal suits closing the exits. He didn't notice the silent, tall figure with jet black hair and a steel gray gaze stepping out of the elevator. He didn't know CO Genewuk, Seoul's most feared underground leader. As Naomi's phone buzzed in her pocket with a priority alert, and Genewuk's unreadable, calm eyes locked onto the back of Derek's head, the realization began to settle in the air like a cold mist. Derek hadn't just slapped an ex-wife. He had just declared war on a king's queen. And in exactly 60 seconds, his entire world was going to go dark. The sun rose over the Han River, casting a pale, golden light through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Gangnam penthouse. Naomi Carter sat on the edge of a bed draped in silk sheets that cost more than her father's first house in Atlanta. She ran her fingers over the fabric, her deep brown skin contrasting beautifully with the cream-colored linens, yet she couldn't shake the phantom sensation of the rough, polyester blankets she'd used just 2 years ago in a cramped studio apartment. Even now, surrounded by the quiet hum of high-end climate control and the scent of expensive sandalwood, Naomi felt like a ghost haunting someone else's dream. She stood up, her bare feet sinking into the plush white rug as she moved toward the dressing room. Every movement was practiced and quiet, a habit born from years of trying to remain invisible, trying not to take up too much space in a world that had once discarded her. She opened the wardrobe to find rows of designer dresses, each one a masterpiece of tailoring. Genewuk had insisted she have the best, yet today, she reached for a modest, neutral-toned knit dress. It was clean, elegant, but lacked the loud logos that the socialites of Seoul wore like armor. She dressed herself with a restrained dignity, her movements fluid but cautious. Standing before the vanity, Naomi looked at her reflection. Her soft oval face was framed by natural 3C curls pulled back into a neat, low puff. She looked every bit the part of a woman of means, save for the shadow of quiet pain that lingered in the depths of her almond-shaped eyes. To the world, she was a mystery. To Genewuk, she was his heart. But to herself, she was still a survivor waiting for the other shoe to drop. Before leaving, she slipped on her simple shoulder bag and checked the hidden wedding ring beneath the sleeve of her cardigan. The weight of the diamond was a constant reminder of the man who had saved her, yet she kept it tucked away, a secret treasure. She wasn't ready to be a queen in public yet. For now, she was content to be the hidden wife of the city's most dangerous man, unaware that the peace she had carefully built was about to be shattered by a ghost from her past. CO Genewuk stood in his private office, the heavy silence of the room punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a vintage clock. He stared at a wall of monitors, his gaze fixed on one particular screen that tracked a small, unassuming GPS signal moving through the streets of Seoul. To the world, he was a man of ice, a leader whose very name commanded a terrifying respect in the underworld. But when it came to Naomi, that ice didn't just melt, it burned. His obsession was not one of control, but of a fierce, silent preservation. He knew every scar on her heart, the ones left by the man who had discarded her like trash. It was for that reason he allowed her these solitary excursions. He understood that for a woman who had been stripped of her agency, the ability to walk through a store and choose a simple item for herself was a vital reclamation of her soul. He let her shop alone because he wanted her to feel free, even if that freedom was an illusion maintained by the 4 elite guards he had trailing her at a distance of exactly 30 yards. He watched the signal pause near the latte department store. Genewuk leaned back in his leather chair, his light-medium Korean beige skin appearing pale under the fluorescent lights. His jaw tightened as he remembered the way she had looked when he first found her, broken, starving, and yet carrying a dignity that no amount of poverty could crush. He had made a silent vow then. He would build a fortress around her, not of stone, but of power. He reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over her contact. He wanted to call her just to hear the soft, melodic cadence of her voice, but he restrained himself. He didn't want to intrude on her peace. He would be her shadow, the unseen force that ensured the world never laid a cruel hand on her again. He believed his influence was total, his protection absolute. He had no way of knowing that within the hour, the very ghost he had sworn to keep away from her was about to step into the light, and that his silent vow was about to be tested in the most violent way possible. The air in the luxury boutique was thick with the scent of expensive leather and French perfume, a fragrance that usually brought Naomi a sense of calm. She was examining a hand-stitched silk scarf, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns, when the glass doors hissed open. A boisterous, arrogant laugh cut through the quiet elegance of the store, a sound so familiar it made the blood turn to ice in Naomi's veins. She froze, her hand hovering over the display. She would know that sharp, condescending tone anywhere. It was the sound of her nightmares, the soundtrack to the darkest years of her life in Atlanta. Slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, she turned her head. Standing near the entrance, flanked by 2 middle-aged Korean businessmen in sharp suits, was Derek Lawson. He looked exactly as he did the day he had shoved her out of their shared apartment with nothing but a trash bag of clothes. Loud, posturing, and desperately hungry for status. He wore a designer jacket that screamed for attention and a thick gold chain that glinted mockingly under the recessed lighting. He was gesturing expansively, clearly in the middle of a pitch. "I'm telling you, gentlemen, my firm is the only one with the reach to take your brand into the States," he bragged, his voice echoing off the polished walls. He was here in Seoul, miles from the life he had destroyed, trying to close the biggest deal of his career. Naomi tried to shrink back, her instinct for survival screaming at her to vanish. She adjusted her modest cardigan, hoping her simple attire would act as a cloak. But as Derek scanned the room, his eyes, narrow and predatory, locked onto her. The smug grin on his face faltered, replaced by a look of bewildered recognition that quickly sharpened into a cruel, jagged smile. "Naomi?" he said, his voice dropping into a register of pure malice. The businessman paused, looking between the two. "I'll be damned. I thought I smelled something cheap the moment I walked in." The ghost of Atlanta hadn't just returned. He was standing 10 feet away, and the fragile piece Naomi had built was beginning to crack. Derek stepped closer, his polished shoes clicking sharply on the marble floor as he invaded Naomi's personal space. The 2 Korean businessmen watched with curious, slightly uncomfortable expressions, but Derek was too fueled by his own perceived superiority to care about the audience. He looked Naomi up and down, his lip curling in a sneer that radiated years of unchecked malice. "Look at this," Derek said, gesturing toward her neutral-toned knit dress and plain shoulder bag. 5 years in Seoul and you're still dressed like you're waiting for a handout at a bus station. Did you sneak in through the service entrance? Or are you just here to scrub the floors? Naomi felt the heat of humiliation rising to her cheeks, but she didn't look away. Her jaw remained slightly slack in shock, yet her eyes held a quiet, restrained dignity that seemed to infuriate him even more. She was a black woman who had survived his worst, and her silence was a mirror reflecting his own ugliness. "I asked you a question, Naomi." Derek barked, his voice rising, drawing the attention of other shoppers and boutique staff. This is a place for winners. People with vision. Not for a broken, discarded anchor who tried to drag me down with her. I am just shopping, Derek, Naomi said softly, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Please, just leave me alone. Shopping? Derek let out a harsh, jagged laugh. With what? You don't belong among these things. You are an eyesore. In a sudden, violent blur of motion, his frustration boiled over. He didn't see the subtle movement of the charcoal-suited men near the entrance, nor did he see the security cameras swiveling toward him. He only saw the woman he thought he still owned. His hand whipped through the air, a sharp, stinging crack that echoed through the high-end boutique. The force of the slap sent Naomi's head snapping to the side, her feet freezing in place as she stumbled back into a display of glass-encased perfumes. The sound was deafening in the sudden silence of the mall. Naomi's hand went instinctively to her burning cheek, her eyes wide with a shock that transcended physical pain. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply stood there, a survivor of a blow that Derek Lawson didn't realize would cost him everything. The store was still ringing with the sound of the blow when the lead security operative, hidden behind a display of watches, tapped his earpiece. His voice was a low, jagged whisper that signaled the end of the world for everyone in the room. Code Black. The Queen has been struck. Boutique Level 3. Miles away, in a boardroom that overlooked the sprawling concrete jungle of Seoul, the atmosphere shifted from corporate tension to a lethal chill. CEO Genewuk was in the middle of a multi-billion-won merger, surrounded by elderly chairmen who held the city's economy in their hands. His phone, placed face-up on the mahogany table, vibrated once. A single red notification light pulsed like a dying heart. Genewuk didn't check the message. He didn't have to. The Code Black alert was a frequency reserved for only one person and one scenario. His unreadable, calm eyes suddenly darkened, the light medium beige of his skin turning a ghostly, disciplined pale. Without a word of apology or explanation, he stood up. Mr. CEO? We haven't finished the clause on, the lead investor began, but the words died in his throat as Genewuk turned his gaze toward him. It was the look of a man who was already deciding where to bury his enemies. Genewuk swept his suit jacket from the back of his chair, his movements upright and perfectly groomed despite the sudden violence of his intent. He walked out of the boardroom, his broad shoulders cutting a path through his own staff who scrambled to get out of his way. Behind him, his personal assistant was already on the phone, barked orders echoing down the hall. Clear the roads. Get the motorcade to the latte entrance. Now. As he stepped into the private elevator, Genewuk adjusted his minimalist wristwatch. He wasn't thinking about the merger or the money he was leaving on the table. He was thinking about the hand that had dared to touch Naomi's skin. His silence was no longer a sign of authority, it was a promise of total, systematic destruction. He had spent years ensuring she felt safe, and in one reckless second, a ghost had undone his work. Genewuk intended to make sure that ghosts never walked the earth again. Naomi remained on the floor, the stinging heat on her cheek pulsating in time with the thundering beat of her heart. Around her, the air felt thick and stagnant, as if the luxury boutique had been submerged underwater. She could see the jagged shards of a shattered perfume bottle near her hand, the expensive scent of jasmine and bergamot now cloying and suffocating. Derek stood over her, his chest heaving with a twisted sense of triumph. He looked down at her with narrow, hostile eyes, his arms still partially extended from the force of the blow. Look at you, he sneered, his voice cutting through the silence of the gathered crowd. Still exactly where I left you. At the bottom. You thought you could come to a place like Seoul and reinvent yourself? You're a ghost, Naomi. A broke, pathetic ghost of the woman I used to own. Naomi didn't cry. Though her breath was caught in a mid-inhale sob that threatened to break her, she forced it back. She leaned into the tension in her neck and shoulders, slowly pulling herself into a seated position on the cold marble. Her eyes, wide with shock but hardening with a sudden, icy clarity, fixed on Derek's face. She watched the way his skin looked slightly uneven under the harsh designer lights, the way his status-driven jacket seemed too tight for a man of his small character. You haven't changed at all, Derek, she said, her voice a low, raspy whisper that carried more weight than his shouting. Shut up, he barked, invading her space again, his polished shoe inches from her hand. You have nothing. No one. I'm about to sign a deal that will put my name on buildings in this city, while you'll still be scavenging for scraps. I should have slapped some sense into you years ago. He continued to rail against her, a verbal tirade fueled by the deep-seated insecurity of a man who needed to crush someone else to feel tall. Naomi tuned out the words, focusing instead on the 4 charcoal-suited figures who had moved with surgical precision to block the boutique's exits. She saw the lead guard's hand hover near his earpiece, his gaze fixed on the elevator banks across the mall. She wasn't a charity case, and she wasn't alone. As Derek's face contorted with another insult, Naomi felt the hidden weight of the diamond ring beneath her sleeve. She realized then that the silence in the room wasn't for her. It was the silence that preceded a landslide. She remained frozen in time, not out of fear, but because she was witnessing the final moments of Derek Lawson's life as he knew it. The heavy glass doors of the boutique didn't just open, they seemed to surrender. The frantic energy of Derek's shouting was instantly smothered by a predatory silence that rolled into the room like a localized winter. It started at the entrance, a ripple of movement as the onlookers, who had been filming the drama on their phones, suddenly lowered their devices and stepped back, their faces draining of color. The crowd parted with a primal, instinctive urgency, clearing a wide, unobstructed path toward the center of the store. Emerging from the shadows of the mall corridor was CEO Genewuk. He moved with a terrifying, upright stillness, his tall frame cutting a sharp silhouette against the bright luxury lighting. His charcoal suit was perfectly pressed, his jet-black hair undisturbed, but his presence was a physical weight that made the air feel thin and brittle. Derek, still mid-sentence, felt the shift before he saw the source. He turned, his lips still curled in a sneer, but the insult died in his throat. He looked at Genewuk, the square jaw, the high cheekbones, and the eyes that held the cold, unreadable depths of a deep-sea trench. Derek was a man who understood power only through noise and jewelry, but the man walking toward him was power personified through silence. Genewuk didn't look at the crowd, and he didn't look at the businessmen trembling behind Derek. His focus was a laser, locked entirely on Naomi. As he stepped onto the marble floor where she sat, his gaze dropped to her reddened cheek. For a microsecond, a vein pulsed at his temple, the only sign of the lethal rage boiling beneath his light-medium beige skin. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The 4 security guards who had been standing idle suddenly snapped to attention, their hands moving in unison to their sides. The atmosphere in the room turned so cold that the very breath seemed to catch in everyone's lungs. Derek took an involuntary step back, his arrogance finally flickering with the first true spark of fear. He had been the predator a moment ago, but as Genewuk stopped exactly 3 feet away, the reality of the food chain became agonizingly clear. The king had arrived, and the air itself was declaring that a debt was about to be paid in blood. Derek felt the sudden drop in temperature, but his ego was too loud to let him hear the warning bells. He straightened his branded jacket, his hand half-clenched in a reflex of aggression as he looked at the newcomer. Genewuk stood motionless, his silent presence radiating a type of danger Derek had only ever seen in movies, a controlled, absolute authority that made the tough guy act look like a child's tantrum. "And who the hell are you?" Derek snapped, his voice cracking slightly before he forced it back into a growl. He stepped away from Naomi, moving toward Genewuk with a puffed chest, invading the space of a man who didn't flinch. "This is a private conversation between me and my ex. You're interrupting a very important business meeting with people you probably couldn't even afford to work for." Genewuk didn't answer. He didn't even acknowledge Derek's proximity. Instead, his calm, unreadable eyes drifted down to the floor, where Naomi was beginning to stand. His expression remained a mask of disciplined Korean beige, but the air around him seemed to thicken. "I'm talking to you," Derek shouted, emboldened by the lack of immediate retaliation. He turned to the 2 Korean businessmen behind him, looking for validation. "You see this guy? Probably some mid-level manager trying to play hero. Hey, buddy, I'm Derek Lawson. I'm the CEO of Lawson Global. I'm about to be one of the biggest investors in this city." He turned back to Genewuk, pointing a finger at his chest. You want to keep your job? You better turn around and walk away before I make one phone call and end your career. The silence that followed was suffocating. The boutique staff had completely retreated, and even the air conditioning seemed to stop humming. Genewuk finally looked at Derek. It wasn't a look of anger, it was the look of a scientist observing a particularly annoying insect before crushing it. One phone call. Genewuk's voice finally emerged, not a shout, but a low, velvet baritone that carried to every corner of the room. Please, make it. I would like to see who in this city answers a call from a dead man. Derek laughed, a nervous, jagged sound. A dead man? What are you, some kind of poet? You're a nobody. Naomi only attracts nobodies. He looked back at Naomi, sneering. Is this him? Is this your new little boyfriend? You went from a king like me to this. Derek had no idea that at that very second, his name was being erased from every database in the city. He was still acting tough, unaware that he was standing on the edge of an abyss, and the man in front of him was the one who owned the fall. The tension in the boutique reached a fever pitch as the sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the marble corridor. Derek, still wearing his mask of arrogant defiance, turned toward the entrance with a look of relief. There they are, he gloated, casting a final, mocking glance at Genewuk. The real power in this city. Watch and learn, hero. Two men in charcoal gray suits burst through the doors, the senior executives of the investment firm Derek had been courting for months. These were the men who held the keys to his future, the ones he had spent weeks trying to impress with his Lawson Global branding and leased luxury cars. Derek stepped forward, his hand extended, a sycophantic grin plastered on his face. Mr. Park, Mr. Choi. Perfect timing. I was just dealing with this disruption. This man is interfering with. He never finished the sentence. The two executives didn't even see Derek's hand. They didn't see the display of perfumes or the scattered glass. Their eyes were locked on the tall, silent figure standing next to Naomi. As if pulled by a single string, both men skidded to a halt and dropped into deep, 90-degree bows, their foreheads nearly touching their knees. Chairman CEO, they shouted in unison, their voices trembling with a terror so visceral it seemed to vibrate the air. We did not know you were here. Please, forgive our intrusion. The silence that followed was absolute. Derek's extended hand began to shake, his fingers curling into a useless claw as the reality of the situation crashed down on him. He looked at the executives, men he considered the pinnacle of Seoul's elite, cowering like servants before the man he had just called a nobody. Genewuk didn't acknowledge the bows. He didn't even look at the executives. His gaze remained fixed on Derek, whose medium brown skin had turned a sickly, ashen gray. The tough guy, fade, and the gold chain now looked like a costume for a man who had accidentally stepped into a lion's den. You wanted to make a phone call, Mr. Lawson, Genewuk said, his voice a low, lethal murmur that cut through the silence. These are the men you were going to call. They are currently bowing to my shoes. Would you like to ask them for that favor now? Derek's jaw worked, but no sound came out. The realization was a physical blow. He hadn't just slapped an ex-wife. He had struck the wife of the man who owned the very ground he stood on. The recognition was complete, and the terror was only just beginning. The air in the boutique grew thick and heavy, as if the gravity itself had shifted under Genewuk's command. He stepped over the scattered glass and shattered perfume bottles, stopping inches from Derek, who was now trembling so violently that the gold chain around his neck rattled against his chest. Genewuk didn't reach for a weapon. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a slim, leather-bound tablet. 5 years ago, in Atlanta, Genewuk began, his voice a velvet scalpel that cut through the silence. You withdrew $24,000 from a joint savings account while my wife was asleep. You left her with exactly $12.82. Do you remember? Derek's mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. His eyes darted toward his business partners, but they remained frozen in their bows, terrified to even draw breath. You sold her grandmother's wedding set for $3,000 to cover a gambling debt. You took the title to her car, a vehicle she needed to get to work, and signed it over to a lender for $5,000. Genewuk scrolled through the digital screen with a disciplined, slow motion. The total amount you stole from Naomi Carter, including her lost wages and the liquidated assets of her small business, was precisely $41,600. Genewuk finally looked up, his unreadable eyes boring into Derek's soul. In my world, Mr. Lawson, theft is not settled in court. It is settled with interest. I have calculated the emotional and financial toll at a rate of 1,000%. The current balance stands at $416,000, Genewuk said, his tone as casual as if he were discussing the weather. And since you are here in Seoul to sign a deal worth 10 times that, I believe you have the liquid assets. However, I don't want your money, Derek. I want what it represents. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. By the time you leave this mall, you will be exactly as you left her. Empty, penniless, and invisible. Genewuk turned back to Naomi, his expression softening for a fraction of a second as he offered her his hand. Behind him, the two executives finally stood, their faces pale as they realized their first task under the chairman's new order, the total financial erasure of Derek Lawson. The silence in the boutique was no longer peaceful. It was a vacuum, sucking the very life out of Derek's existence. Genewuk didn't move, and he didn't speak another word to the man trembling before him. He simply reached out, his fingers brushing against Naomi's uninjured cheek with a tenderness that contradicted the lethal aura surrounding him. Behind them, the two Korean executives were already on their phones, their voices hushed but frantic as they executed the chairman's silent command. The digital world moved faster than Derek's ability to comprehend his own ruin. Derek's phone, tucked into the pocket of his branded jacket, began to vibrate. Then it chirped. Then it screamed with a barrage of notifications. He pulled it out with shaking hands, his eyes widening as he stared at the screen. The banking app that had shown a comfortable six-figure balance just minutes ago now displayed a chilling, flat zero. The screen flickered, and a red banner appeared. Account restricted. Contact security. What did you do? Derek whispered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched plea. He tried to swipe, to call his bank, but the device suddenly went black. A remote wipe had been triggered, erasing his contacts, his emails, and the very proof of his Lawson global empire. The lease on his luxury car in the parking garage was cancelled. The reservation at his five-star hotel was voided. In the span of a few heartbeats, the digital tether that connected Derek to his status had been severed. The two executives stepped forward, their faces grim. Mr. Lawson, one said, his tone devoid of the respect he had shown moments earlier. Our firm has terminated all negotiations with your entity. Furthermore, we will be notifying our international partners of your ethical liabilities. You are persona non grata in this city. Derek looked around the room, realizing that the luxury items he had used to mock Naomi were now walls of a prison he couldn't afford to stand in. He was a man with a gold chain and a polished suit, but no money to pay for the air he was breathing. He looked at Naomi, searching for a spark of the pity he used to exploit, but he found only the calm, steady gaze of a woman who was finally watching a ghost fade away. The blackout was complete. Derek Lawson was officially a nobody in the City of Kings. The heavy, armored door of the Bentley Mulsanne closed with a soft, vacuum-sealed thud, instantly severing the connection to the chaos of the mall. Outside, the world was still reeling from the spectacle of Derek's downfall, but inside, the air was still and scented with the familiar, comforting aroma of Genewuk's expensive cologne. The car pulled away smoothly, the tinted glass turning the neon lights of Seoul into blurred streaks of violet and blue. For a long moment, there was only silence. Naomi sat stiffly against the hand-stitched leather seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The adrenaline that had kept her upright in the boutique was beginning to drain away, leaving a hollow, aching cold in its wake. Genewuk didn't speak. He reached out, his large, calloused hand covering her smaller ones. The warmth of his touch was the catalyst. A single, jagged sob escaped Naomi's throat, and then the floodgates opened. She collapsed inward, her forehead resting against his shoulder as years of buried humiliation, the hunger she had hidden, and the terror of seeing Derek again poured out in a torrent of silent tears. The man who was feared by every captain of industry and underground leader in the city shifted. He didn't offer platitudes or tell her to be strong. Instead, CEO Genewuk wrapped his arms around her, pulling her onto his lap with a fierce, protective urgency. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breath warm against her skin. "I am sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking with a raw, human emotion he never showed the world. "I am sorry I let his shadow touch you again." In the privacy of the darkened car, the underground king was gone. There was only a man who loved a woman so deeply it terrified him. He held her as she shook, his fingers gently stroking her curls, anchoring her to the present. He let her be small, let her be broken, because he knew that his strength was not just for crushing enemies, but for providing a sanctuary where she never had to hide her pain again. As the car sped toward the safety of their penthouse, Naomi finally let go of the ghost of Atlanta, cradled in the arms of the only man who truly saw her. While Naomi found her sanctuary in the quiet luxury of the Bentley, Genewuk's digital shadow was busy completing the execution. He sat beside her, his hands still stroking her hair, while his other hand tapped a single command on a secure tablet. "Distribute it," he murmured into his earpiece, his voice like dry ice. The mechanism of social suicide was instantaneous. Using the data harvested during the initial Code Black breach, Genewuk's team had bypassed the security of Derek's wipe device to access his cloud-based contact list. In a matter of seconds, a high-definition video file was sent to every person Derek had ever tried to impress. The footage was raw and damning. It showed the high-end boutique in crystal clarity, Derek's sneering face, his predatory stance, and the sickening sound of his palm connecting with Naomi's cheek. It captured his verbal abuse in high-fidelity audio, stripping away the polished businessman facade to reveal the violent, insecure man beneath. The file didn't just land in the inboxes of his business associates. It was pushed to his family in Atlanta, his former colleagues, and every prominent social circle in Seoul. As Derek sat in the mall security office, trying to beg for a phone he no longer owned, the world he had spent years fabricating was collapsing in real time. Comments and shares began to climb into the thousands. The Lawson Global LinkedIn page was flooded with vitriol. His fiancée's phone buzzed with the footage, followed by a text from her father, "The wedding is off. Do not come home." Genewuk watched the engagement metrics on his screen with a cold, detached satisfaction. He wasn't just taking Derek's money, he was taking his name. In the modern world, a man without a reputation was a man who didn't exist. By the time the car reached the penthouse, Derek Lawson's face was the global face of cowardice. He had wanted to be a man everyone recognized, and now, Genewuk had granted that wish. He was famous, and he would never be able to show his face in a civilized room again. The social execution was final, leaving nothing but a hollow shell where a predator once stood. The air at the Grand Hyatt ballroom was thick with the scent of lilies and the hushed whispers of Seoul's most elite. This was the Blue Moon Gala, an event where fortunes were made and reputations were cemented. For years, Naomi had navigated these circles like a shadow, dressing in muted tones and slipping through side entrances to avoid the prying eyes of the paparazzi. But tonight, the woman who had once frozen in fear at a department store was gone. Standing before the full-length mirror in their penthouse, Naomi adjusted the weight of the gown Genewuk had selected for her, a masterpiece of midnight blue silk that clung to her soft curves and made her deep warm brown skin glow like burnished mahogany. Her 3C curls were styled in a sophisticated, voluminous half-up look, revealing the subtle sheen on her cheekbones. Finally, she reached for the item she had spent months concealing. She slipped the heavy, platinum wedding band onto her finger, the central diamond catching the light with a blinding brilliance. When they arrived at the gala, the usual chaos of the red carpet fell into a stunned, reverent silence. Genewuk stepped out of the limousine first, his presence as commanding and upright as ever. But instead of walking ahead, he reached back, offering his hand to Naomi. As she stepped into the light, the flashing cameras were a frantic storm. She didn't flinch. She leaned into the tension of her shoulders, her jaw set with a quiet, restrained dignity that commanded more attention than any shout ever could. Genewuk placed a protective hand on the small of her back as they entered the ballroom. Heads turned, and whispers rippled through the crowd like a tidal wave. They saw the nobody from the viral video, the woman Derek Lawson had dared to strike, standing as the undisputed first lady of the city's most powerful empire. Naomi didn't look for the cameras or the critics. She looked only at the man beside her, her chin held high. For the first time in her life, she wasn't hiding from her past. She was stepping into a future where the ring on her finger was not just a symbol of love, but a shield that no ghost could ever hope to pierce. 6 months later, the glass doors of a newly renovated building in the heart of Itaewon swung open, not to reveal a luxury boutique, but a sanctuary. Above the entrance, elegant silver lettering announced the Carterio Foundation. Naomi stood at the podium in the main hall, her deep warm brown skin glowing under the soft lights. She was no longer wearing her wedding ring hidden under a sleeve. It sat proudly on her finger, a testament to a partnership built on mutual respect and protection. The room was filled with women from all over the world, expatriates who, like her, had come to Korea with dreams only to find themselves vulnerable, abandoned, or exploited. Naomi looked out at them, her almond-shaped eyes no longer carrying the weight of quiet pain, but the fire of a woman who had reclaimed her voice. Beside her, Genewuk stood in his customary tailored black suit, his presence a silent, immovable mountain of support. He didn't lead this initiative, he followed her lead, providing the resources while she provided the vision. "I know what it's like to have your dignity stolen," Naomi began, her voice steady and clear, reaching every corner of the room. "I know the cold of a city that doesn't speak your language when you have nothing left. But I also know that your past is not a life sentence. This foundation is a promise that no woman in this city will have to face her ghosts alone." The foundation offered legal aid, emergency housing, and financial literacy, the very things Naomi had been denied years ago. As she spoke, she saw the faces of the women brighten, their postures straightening as they looked at the woman who had become a symbol of resilience. She was no longer the broke ex-wife or the hidden queen. She was a force of nature. As the applause erupted, Genewuk stepped forward, briefly taking her hand in a rare public display of affection. He looked at her with a pride that eclipsed any business victory. The era of survival was over, the era of Naomi Carterio had begun. She had turned the sting of a public slap into a global movement, proving that while a predator can strike a woman down, he can never stop her from rising as a queen. Thank you for watching till the very end. You're the best. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more Syndicate Soul Stories content. Drop a comment telling us where you are watching.